Please be aware, in this podcast series we talk about all areas of safeguarding, which some people may find upsetting. So please make sure you're okay listening to today's topic. Be mindful of those around you, such as children, that you might not want to listen in. Hi, I'm SSS Safeguarding Director Sam Preston.
And I'm former head teacher and content author Sara.
Today we're revisiting the government's Prevent programme and, in the wake of the Southport attacks, discussing mental health in relation to assessing extremism. The tragic Southport attack, which claimed the lives of the three little girls, Bibi, Elsie and Alice, has raised serious questions about the effectiveness of safeguarding and counter-extremism efforts in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. The attacker, Axel Ruda-Cabana, had a history of interactions with police, social services, mental health professionals and the Prevent programme.
Yeah, and I think before we kind of jump into it, it's maybe just worth clarifying for those listening not aware of what Prevent is, Sarah. So, Prevent is the UK government programme that aims to prevent people from becoming terrorists or supporting terrorism and acting on extremist ideology. It's a safeguarding initiative that uses early intervention to assess and then forward to intervention if needed to challenge extremist and terrorist ideology.
Yeah, and I think, in the Ruda-Cabana case, despite multiple referrals to Prevent, no intervention stopped his path towards violence. And this case has sort of reignited debates around mental health, radicalisation, and whether Prevent is equipped to deal with non-ideological extremism. Sam, I think it's good if we start by looking at those key questions here. How do we define terrorism in cases like this?
Well, that is a critical point, Sarah. Traditionally, terrorism has been associated with political or religious ideology. But the Southport attack highlights the growing issue of individuals who commit extreme violence without a clear ideological motive. And that was certainly in the case of the Ruda-Cabana case. So, just 33% of Prevent referrals last year were for individuals with no ideology. So that was concerns about individuals, but there was actually no ideology behind those concerns. So that suggests a shift in the landscape of extremism, where violence can emerge from psychological issues or psychiatric issues or personal grievances, rather than organised terrorist networks. And the Crown Prosecution Service described Ruda-Cabana as having, and I'll quote, a sickening and sustained interest in death and violence. So his actions were premeditated, they were brutal, and they were indiscriminate. But was this terrorism as we define it now, or was it criminal pathology? And if it doesn't fit into traditional definitions, do we need to rethink how we address violent extremism?
I think those are such important questions. If Prevent is expanding to deal with individuals who display violent tendencies but aren't necessarily radicalised, does it change, therefore, its purpose? I think that's a really key question.
And that's one of the biggest concerns. Because if Prevent is stretched too far, trying to handle individuals with severe mental health issues rather than those driven by extremist ideology, there's a risk of losing focus on Prevent's core mission. On the other hand, ignoring these cases will allow more tragedies to unfold. So the Southport attack suggests that gaps in the system between counter-terrorism, social services and mental health are allowing dangerous individuals to slip through. And I will just say, in the Ruda-Cabana case, he was referred to Prevent at several times and it didn't fit their criteria. He was also referred to child and adolescent mental health services, but wouldn't engage. So there's been a lot of focus on the fact of has Prevent failed in this instance? But I think, as we just alluded to, we actually need to look at that whole wraparound about if there is a concern about child or a young person, if it doesn't fit with somebody's assessment profile, it just doesn't kind of sit there until somebody else picks it up.
Yeah, right. That does bring us to that other major issue, doesn't it? What role did mental health services play or fail to play in this case? That's a crucial question, isn't it?
Yeah, and it is. And it's a big part of this discussion. We often hear that mental illness does not cause terrorism, but the reality is actually more complex. I think that's a phrase that's kind of trotted out, and it's a soundbite, really. Some individuals with severe mental health conditions may be more susceptible to engaging in violence, particularly if their symptoms are untreated or misunderstood by safeguarding agencies. And Rudy Cabana had, as I've said, 3 Prevent referrals as a teenager, yet none of them led to lasting intervention. When they didn't fit Prevent, where was the intervention? And why were they dismissed as a mental health issue rather than a safeguarding concern? Because when there is a mental health issue, there is still a safeguarding concern. So aligning the agency that's going to take action, so in that case, it was child and adolescent mental health, it doesn't take away from the fact that there's a safeguarding responsibility. And that's where the gap is. So did agencies assume that he wasn't a serious risk because his actions weren't linked to political ideology? Yeah. So I think the Prevent Learning Review into this case will look at why these referrals were closed and whether there needs to be a closer link between Prevent and psychiatric and psychological services. But that raises another issue. Does merging these fields risk stigmatising mental illness?
Yeah, you're right. And that's such a fine line to walk, isn't it? We don't want to criminalise or label people with mental health issues as terrorists.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, we can't ignore warning signs of extreme violence. So I suppose that leads us to another key question. What happens when Prevent referrals don't result in action?
Yeah, well, that's where the system really needs scrutiny. The Working Together to Safeguard Children framework, that's the statutory multi-agency document that is in place to guide multi-agency practice. I mean, that was developed in 2015, and we're still talking about trying to get multi-agencies to work together. So that framework is supposed to ensure that vulnerable young people don't fall through the cracks, but in this case, it's failed. So Rudy Cabana had contact with multiple agencies, social services, the youth justice system, mental health professionals and Prevent, yet despite these touch points, no one connected the dots and took decisive action. So I think one of the biggest questions now is, when a Prevent referral's closed, is there a system in place to ensure that the individual is still being monitored through other safeguarding mechanisms? Or does the case just simply vanish into who's going to pick it up next? And there's kind of like this lull.
Absolutely. Such an important point. Like, if a person is flagged as a potential risk, but then no action is taken, we're left with a dangerous gap in the system, aren't we? And now, with the Home Secretary calling for a public inquiry, what can we expect from this review, do you think?
Well, the public inquiry is set to focus on 3 key areas. So why Rudy Cabana's Prevent referrals were closed and whether new criteria is needed to assess risk in cases where ideology isn't present. Although I think that does open up a bit of a discussion. I think there needs to be a further discussion in that should Prevent be about the risk of extremism and terrorism linked to an ideology? I'm not sure Prevent is equipped to actually support where it's not. It certainly isn't in its current form. So I would say that that's something they've missed from this inquiry. It's also going to look at the role of mental health services. Should there be better mechanisms for recognising and responding to signs of extreme violence? And it's going to look at gaps between safeguarding agencies. So it's going to examine how we ensure individuals flagged as potential risks are properly managed, even if they don't meet traditional terrorist profiles.
Yeah.
And there's a growing consensus that the UK's approach to violent extremism needs reform. And the Southport attack has shown that extremism isn't just about ideology, it can also be about the violence itself.
And that's a terrifying prospect, isn't it? You know, if some of the most dangerous individuals aren't driven by a structured ideology, does that make them even harder to predict?
Yeah, exactly. And traditional counter-terrorism strategies, they rely on identifying networks, online activity, and ideological red flags. But if someone commits mass violence without any of those factors, how do we intervene before it's too late?
Yeah, and ultimately, that's the big question. How do we prevent future tragedies like this?
Well, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because it is going to require absolute systemic change. We need to bridge the gaps between, I'm hearing myself saying this and I'm thinking, you know, it just feels like deja vu. We need to bridge the gaps between mental health services, safeguarding services and counter-terrorism. We also need to ensure that when those warning signs appear, and let's face it, particularly, I think our school's the second biggest referral into prevent after the police. They've become through training. I know we've obviously been providing training on this for a very long time now. Those referrals are definitely more accurate into that service. I think it's more than just, let's get the referrals in to be appropriate.
Yeah.
We need to ensure that when any warning signs appear, whether through prevent referrals or through social care, they're not ignored or dismissed, or they're not wrapped up in waiting lists for referrals. So at the same time, we need to be very careful not to conflate mental illness with terrorism. A nuanced multi-agency approach is key, one that ensures intervention happens before individuals reach the point of no return.
Absolutely. You know, and until those reforms happen, the families of BBLC and Alice, you know, are left asking the hardest question of all. How did the system fail so badly?
And that's the tragic reality. And that's why this inquiry is so important. And I'm sure we will be revisiting this. We'll be coming back to this with more coverage, and we'll certainly be doing a follow-up on the inquiry findings.
Excellent.